Good afternoon and welcome to the candidate and third-party advertiser information session for the 2022 municipal election. Can everybody hear me okay? Good. My name is Manon Levesque and I'm the city clerk in charge of the municipal elections for Cornwall. Joining me is Carmen Cousineau, the election coordinator. Want to lift your hand up, Carmen? Perfect. And Janelle Mallion, the city's deputy clerk. There we go. Hi, Janelle. Also joining me this afternoon are our presenters, Peter Sisov and Lisa Harvey. Peter and Lisa are municipal advisors with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. More specifically, they work in the ministry's Regional East Municipal Services Office, which is located in Kingston. Their office provides services and advice to 114 municipalities in Eastern Ontario on such municipal topics as local governance, administration, finance, land use, planning, and housing. Lisa has been with the provincial government for 15 years and with the ministry for 5 years. Peter has been with the ministry since 2013. Before starting our session, I want to once again indicate that this information session is being recorded and that once we get to the question and answer period, the recording will be turned off. So please feel at ease to ask any questions that you may have. The recording of this information session will then be uploaded to the city's website. Now, without further ado, I will turn this presentation over to Peter and Lisa.
Thank you, Manon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Harvey, and as mentioned, attending along with me today from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing is Peter Sisov. I would like to thank the City of Cornwall Clerk Manon Levesque for inviting us and for hosting this candidate and third-party advertiser information session. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Here we go, exactly where I want to be. Thank you. This presentation is meant to be a summary of some of the sections and should not be relied on for legal or official purposes. I do want to stress that we are not lawyers and that you should always consult the legislation and seek legal advice when necessary. We will not be able to cover every aspect of the municipal election, but hope that this provides you with a better understanding of the process and legislation and improves your comfort level. Congratulations for taking an interest in your community and in local government. Whether you're interested in serving on municipal council or on school board or registering as a third-party advertiser. Next slide, please. This slide outlines some of the topics we want to cover during this session. I will be covering the first 3 topics: the roles of elected members of council, head of council, and municipal staff, as well as the role of the school board trustees, who is eligible to run for municipal office and school boards, and who is not, the nomination process, and how a candidate withdraws a nomination. Also, what happens if a candidate files a nomination and then changes his or her mind about which office they wish to run for. Then Peter will follow and present the following sections: campaign finances, compliance audit initiated by an application, voters list and voting proxy, scrutineers, recounts, and finally a list of resources that can assist you. Next slide, please. So you are considering running for municipal office. Congratulations. Local government is the level of government that is closest to the people, and it is the most accessible and responsive to the needs of the community. You've made a decision to throw your hat in the ring Or you're thinking about it and you're curious to know how to go about it. Perhaps it's something that you've always wanted to pursue, or you want to make a difference, or you're not happy with some of the decisions that have been made, or you have a passion for politics. Regardless, it's a 4-year commitment and will be filled with challenges, excitement, disappointments, hard work, and a great deal of satisfaction. Ontario's municipal governments deliver local services, while the province establishes the legislation and policy framework. The Ontario government sets standards for many local services such as land use, planning, building regulation, and social housing. And the province provides funding to municipalities for delivery of some services. The ministry also works in partnership with the municipal sector to support efficient and responsive local governments that are sustainable and investment ready. Local government is a challenging environment with high expectations and limited resources, doing more with less. There is sometimes a limited understanding of roles of council and staff. Government is not like any other business. You can't make everyone happy, so council must make difficult decisions in the best interests of the municipality. Before we get into the overview of the Municipal Elections Act, we wanted to provide a brief summary of the role of elected municipal officials and the role of staff, which I will discuss on this slide. Council and staff roles. First, let me start by saying that Section 2 of the Municipal Act stipulates that municipalities are created by the province to be responsible and accountable governments with respect to matters within their jurisdiction, and each municipality is given powers and duties under the Municipal Act and other pieces of legislation for the purpose of providing good government. The Municipal Act is a legislation framework for municipalities which seeks to balance local autonomy and flexibility with accountability and transparency of municipal operations. The key to any organization, government, business, industry, or local service clubs is for everyone to understand their respective roles and responsibilities. In the next few slides, we are going to review the role of the mayor's role as a chief executive officer, the role of council, and the role of municipal staff, which are all key to an effective and efficient local government. Next slide, please. Okay, let's start with the role of council as a whole. Section 224 of the Municipal Act explains the role of council. It is the role of council to represent the public, to develop and evaluate policies and programs of the municipality, to determine which services the municipality will provide and what levels of service, to ensure that policies, practices, and procedures are in place to implement the decisions of council, to ensure accountability and transparency of operations of the municipality, to maintain the financial integrity, and to carry out the duties of council under the Municipal Act and many other acts. Next slide, please. The role of council continued. It is also the role of council to conduct meetings, to pass bylaws, and to develop policies, which are listed on this slide. I'll give you a few minutes so that you have a few minutes to take a look at which policies are mandated. All of this is done as a collective group, and all members each having one vote. Municipalities are created to be responsible and accountable governments with respect to matters within their jurisdiction, and each municipality is given powers and duties under the Municipal Act and many other acts for the purpose of providing good government with respect to these matters. Next slide, please. Okay, leaving the role of council as a whole, now let's take a look at the role of the head of council. You will find the role of head of council in Section 225 of the Municipal Act. What you see on the slide is exactly what you will see in the piece of legislation in the Municipal Act. The role of the head of council is to act as a leader. The head of council is the chair of the meetings of council and the public face of the municipality. Next slide, please. Although the legislation refers to the head of council as the chief executive officer of the municipality, this may be confusing to people with a business background. The head of council actually has very few powers that can be exercised independently of the rest of council, except where specifically delegated in cases of emergency or in the context of procedural matters during a council meeting. The head of council has no greater power than any other individual member of council. It is important to note that council makes decisions, not any individual council member, including the head of council. To clarify, the head of council always has a vote. There is sometimes confusion on this point in the media and with the public who think that the head of council can only vote in the case of a tie. Another clarification regarding voting. Refraining from voting counts as a no vote. This is spelled out specifically in legislation in the case of recorded votes. A tie loses, so the result is the same as having voted no. Next slide, please. So we looked at the role of council as a whole and the role of the head of council. Now let's take a look at staff roles. The role of staff is set out in Section 227 of the Municipal Act. This would include implementing council's decisions and establish administrative procedures and practices to carry out council's decisions. Undertake research and provide advice to council on policies and programs of the municipality. Carry out duties required by legislation or other duties assigned by the municipality. A key feature of effective and efficient council is a well-developed understanding of the council-staff relations and the role of each party. To find out more about the role of council and staff, please refer to the Counselor's Guide on the ministry's website. This guide is an excellent tool that can provide you with a lot of more information about how municipalities operate and how council and staff can work together in the best interests of the municipality. As you know, there are some municipal staff positions that have statutory obligations: clerk, treasurer, chief building official, and fire chief. It is important that council not interfere with the statutory obligations of those roles. For example, the clerk and treasurer positions have statutory duties or responsibilities assigned to them under the Municipal Act or other pieces of legislation. The Building Code Act would define statutory duties for the chief building official, and the Fire Prevention and Protection Act would define statutory duties for the fire chief. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the role of the Chief Administrative Officer, the CAO. A municipality may appoint a Chief Administrative Officer. The function of the CAO within the municipality is generally akin to the role of Chief Executive Officer in a business environment. The CAO is responsible for the general control and management of the day-to-day operations of the municipality, which may include developing and implementing appropriate internal administrative practices and procedures to ensure the efficient, effective, and accountable operations of the municipality. To help understand the role of the CAO in the municipality, picture an hourglass. Council is at one end, and all the municipal staff and department heads are at the other end. The CAO is in the middle, the smallest part where the sand in the hourglass flows through. So if council wants to give direction to a specific department, the communication would flow through the CAO. Likewise, if the department wants to give information, reports, etc. to council, it too would flow through the CAO. Next slide, please. Council-staff relationship. All municipalities should recognize the importance of council-staff relations. The Councillor's Guide provides some very useful information on how council and staff can work together. This slide provides you with a high-level overview of this relationship. Councils and their administration have different roles within the municipality, but their roles have common goals and common purposes. In general, it is the role of the elected council to represent the community and set the direction and policy for the municipality, and it is the role of staff to manage people and resources to achieve council's vision. Council generally sets the policy direction for the municipality, and staff provides the research and expert advice to help council in its decision-making process. Once council makes a decision, staff generally has a responsibility to implement the policy of council, for example, through administering and delivering services and programs to the community. Staff and council rely on one another to move the municipality forward. Both staff and council provide leadership. Council provides political leadership, while administration provides leadership to the organization. The relationship between staff and council is interconnected, and it's important for council members and staff to respect one another's roles so that they can serve the public in an effective and efficient manner. As mentioned on a previous slide, municipalities are required to adopt a policy on the relationship between members of council and municipal staff. Municipalities have the flexibility to determine the content of these policies. Next slide, please. Continuing with roles and responsibilities. Ensuring accountability and transparency is one of Council's roles under Section 224 of the Municipal Act and is a priority in maintaining public trust. Ontario municipalities and members of Council operate under a legislated accountability and transparency framework that include rules for the municipality and rules for members of Council and local boards. Councillors are, of course, accountable to the public as elected officials. However, it is also important that procedures and policies are clearly set out and accessible, and that the day-to-day operations of the municipality are transparent. This slide outlines policies that council are required to adopt to ensure accountability and transparency. Next slide, please. As mentioned on the prior slide, municipalities are required to adopt a code of conduct for members of council and certain local boards. Codes of conduct usually set out expectations and standards for council conduct. Codes may help prevent ethical conflicts and help in the resolution, serve as a basis for council orientation and training, and serve as a reference throughout the operation of the council's term. With the growing importance of accountability and integrity, municipalities have adopted codes of conduct for members of council and certain local boards. Some have also adopted other procedures, rules, and policies governing the ethical behavior of those members. Municipalities are required to establish codes of conduct for members of council and certain local boards, which must include certain subject matters. These would include gifts, benefits, and hospitality, respectful conduct, including towards officers and employees of the municipality or of the local boards, confidential information, And finally, use of municipal or local board property and equipment. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's shift gear a little bit to the role of the school board trustee. School trustees are members of the school board. They are locally elected representatives of the public, and they are the community's advocate for public education. The Education Act provides 4 different kinds of school boards listed on this slide. Next slide, please. The role of school board trustees is to establish policy direction, participate in making decisions that benefit the entire school board while representing the interests of constituents. School board trustees are accountable to constituents, Ministry of Education, and families. Only the board, not an individual trustee, has the authority to make decisions or take action. A trustee is often the first point of contact for parents and community members who have questions or concerns about their local school boards. Candidates should contact the applicable school board for further information about duties, commitments, etc. Next slide, please. This concludes the roles and responsibilities section of this presentation. We will now look at the eligibility rules. You must be an eligible elector, which means you must be able to vote. So the list above is a list that shows voter eligibility as well as eligibility to run and hold office. You can only be nominated if, as of the day you are nominated, you are qualified to hold that office under the Act and are not ineligible under the Municipal Elections Act or any other act or otherwise prohibited by law to be nominated or to hold the office. Please note the municipal clerk is responsible for setting up and running the voting places used in the municipal election. The clerk must comply with any provincial or local public health measures that are in effect and may also put in place additional procedures that they consider necessary for conducting the election. If you have questions about public health and safety at the polling place, you should contact your municipal clerk. A question that we often have concerns volunteer firefighters. So Section 30 of the Municipal Election Act states that a person shall not be considered an employee for this section by reason only of being a volunteer firefighter, as defined in the Fire Prevention and Protection Act. Next slide, please. If a municipal employee wishes to run for office on that municipality's council, they must take a leave of absence before filing their nomination form. Section 30-4 of the Municipal Election Act. If elected, he or she shall be deemed to have resigned from the employment immediately before making the declaration of office. An employee of a municipality who wants to run for an office in a different municipality doesn't have to take a leave of absence or resign, but they should check with their employer to see if there are any policies that could affect them. Now on this slide, thank you. Questions about school board eligibility should be redirected to the school board secretary. If you are an employee of any school board and you wish to run for a trustee position on any school board in the province, you must take an unpaid leave of absence before you file your nomination form. If elected, you must resign from your job. You cannot work for a school board and be a trustee in Ontario at the same time. The following people are disqualified for being elected as a school trustee. You cannot be a clerk, a deputy clerk, treasurer, or deputy treasurer of a municipality within the jurisdiction of the board. Any person not eligible to vote in the municipality and an employee of a school board unless they take an unpaid leave of absence and resign if elected. Also, like the ineligibility for municipal office, a judge of any court, a member of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, senator, or a member of the House of Commons, and an inmate of a penal or correctional institution under sentence of imprisonment. Next slide, please. So far, we looked at eligibility rules to run and hold municipal office and school board eligibility. Now, let's look at eligibility rules for third-party advertisers. First, a third-party advertiser is an individual, corporation, or trade union that is registered in the municipality to promote, support, or oppose a candidate, or a yes/no answer to a question on a ballot. A third-party advertisement means an advertisement in any broadcast, print, electronic, or other medium that has the purpose of promoting, supporting, or opposing a candidate or a yes/no answer to a question on the ballot. Next slide, please. Only the following persons and entities are eligible to file a notice of registration as a third-party advertiser. An individual who is normally resident in Ontario, a corporation that carries on business in Ontario, and a trade union that holds bargaining rights for employees in Ontario. The ineligible rules are listed on the slide. Next slide, please. Okay, we have now concluded the eligibility rules section of this presentation. The next 6 slides will look at the nomination process. The first day for filing nominations, as you all know, was May 1st, 2022. The last day and time for filing nominations for the 2022 elections is on Friday, August 19th, 2022 by 2 p.m. Withdrawal of a nomination. Local election policies may state a candidate must personally attend the clerk's office to withdraw candidacy. If a candidate is in the hospital, this may not be feasible. If a candidate withdraws a nomination, they are still required to file a campaign financial statement covering all of the financial transactions made in the campaign. If they have not spent any money nor raised any funds, they can click on the box and sign the form, and it is complete. If a nomination is withdrawn, the candidate is entitled to a refund of their nomination filing fee only after they file their financial auditor statements by the required deadline. Next slide, please. Starting on May 1st until the close of business on August 19th, 2022, nominations can be submitted to the clerk from anyone who meets the eligibility criteria to run for office. Candidates must complete Form 1, the nomination paper, and submit it to the clerk along with the applicable nomination filing fees. The filing fee is $200 for anyone running for the head of council and $100 for all other offices. The clerk must be satisfied that you are eligible to run in order to certify your nomination. The clerk can ask you to show identification or to fill out additional forms to prove that you are eligible to run for that particular office. The nomination form must have an original signature. If your nomination is not certified by the clerk, your name will not appear on the ballot. As long as you're eligible to vote in the municipality, you may run in any ward. So talking about ward systems. If you do run in a ward where you do not live, you will not be able to vote for yourself as you must vote in the ward which you reside. Electronic filing. The use of electronic filing for candidates or third-party advertisers is in the clerk's discretion. Even if a clerk permits electronic filing, all campaign documents require original signatures. If electronic filing is permitted, it is the responsibility of the candidate or third-party advertiser to maintain these original records until after the next regular election in 2026. The first day that a candidate may file a nomination or that a third-party advertiser may register, as you know, is May 1st. Next slide, please. Council candidates filing nominations in municipalities with 4,000 electors or more will require 25 signatures to endorse their nominations. This does not apply to school board trustee candidates. Municipal council candidates are required to obtain 25 nomination signatures on Form 2. Ontario Regulation 101-97 provides an exemption to this requirement for candidates in municipalities with less than 4,000 electors. The requirement for nominators to sign nomination forms does not apply to school board candidates, as I mentioned. Nominators can nominate more than one candidate and are not required to vote for that candidate. Nominators must meet the eligibility requirements of a municipal elector at the time that they sign the nomination form. In a ward system, the nominator can be anyone who is eligible to vote in the municipality, not just the ward. Both the clerk and the candidate are entitled to rely upon the information provided by the nominator. If the nominator did not meet the eligibility requirements when they signed the document, then they could be held accountable under the penalty section of the Municipal Elections Act. Next slide, please. Occasionally, a candidate changes their mind and decides to run for a different office. You can run for only one office at a time. If a candidate files a second nomination, the first nomination is deemed to be withdrawn. If a candidate decides to run for another office and they have already collected the 25 endorsement signatures, they can use these endorsements for the other office. If a candidate decides to run for a different office on the same council or school board, and both positions are elected at large, everything from the first campaign is transferred to the second campaign, and only one financial statement needs to be filed. Unless the candidate decides to run for a different office on the same council or school board, and one or both offices are elected by ward, the two campaigns must be kept separate and two financial statements must be filed. Next slide, please. Individuals, corporations, and trade unions may register to be third-party advertisers. There is no registration fee for third-party advertisers. A third-party advertiser would register with the clerk at the local municipality as per section 88.6, subsection 1. Once registered, they may advertise in support of or opposition to any candidate being elected by voters in that municipality. This would include council, trustee, and directed elected upper-tier candidates. To advertise regarding questions on the ballot will require registration as a third-party advertiser. For a regular election, the registration cannot be filed earlier than the first day for filing nominations and cannot be filed later than the Friday before voting day during the clerk's office hours. Section 88.6, subsection 3 notes that once the clerk certifies the notice of registration, the individual, corporation, or trade union is a registered third party for the election. Third-party advertising is geographically based and is structured around the concept of influence a specific set of voters in a specific location. Registering in the municipality where the third-party advertiser hopes to influence votes allows flexibility to support or advocate against any candidate in that specific geography. If an individual wants to influence voters in more than one municipality, for example, over the 3 municipalities covered in a specific school board trustee election, he or she would have to register in each of the 3 municipalities and conduct their activities as 3 separate campaigns. Section 88.7, if the municipality is satisfied that there has been a contravention of the Act, then it can ask the third-party advertiser to remove the advertisement or discontinue the advertising. Next slide, please. Third-party advertiser withdrawal. The third-party advertiser's registration is deemed to be withdrawn if they file a nomination. This means that their advertising campaign would automatically end when they file their nomination. If a corporation or trade union is registered as a third-party advertiser, it would not be affected by a person filing a nomination, as the person would not be the same entity. A third-party advertiser and a candidate would need to be careful to distance their activities, as third-party advertising may not take place under the direction of a candidate. The existing campaign rules, financial rules, would not change. Finances relating to a third-party advertising campaign cannot be transferred to a candidate's campaign. The existing campaign finance rules would not change. To maintain financial transparency around third-party advertising campaigns, the financial statements of advertisers who end their campaign early should reflect their finances as of the day their campaign ended. The registration period for third-party advertisers runs until the Friday before voting day, October 21st, 2022, or the last day the clerk's office is open before voting day in a by-election. We have now concluded the roles and responsibilities section of this presentation. We reviewed the eligibility rules and nomination process. I will now ask my co-worker Peter Sizoff to present the remaining slides, starting with campaign finances. Peter?
Thank you, Lisa. And as Lisa mentioned, this brings our presentation to a next very important phase, which deals with the finances of an election campaign, starting with contributions. So as you can see on the slide, it's important to note that a contribution includes money, goods, or services. It's also helpful to note that campaign bank accounts are only required if the candidate or third-party advertiser raises or spends money. So for acclamations and campaigns where no funds are raised or spent, there is no need for a campaign bank account. I'll also note here that trade unions and corporations are not eligible to contribute to candidates' campaigns, although they can participate in the election as third-party advertisers or make contributions to third-party advertising campaigns. Third-party advertisers will generally need to follow the same rules for raising campaign funds and financial reporting as candidates for office. And you'll see this repeated throughout the presentation, that there are similarities between the processes that third-party advertisers and council candidates need to go through. Municipalities must also establish rules and procedures regarding the use of municipal or local board resources during the campaign period. This must be passed by May 1st in the year of the election. This will encourage accountability and transparency, so ensure that you are aware of the municipality's policy in this regard. It's important to highlight here too that the practice of municipalities providing candidate contact information on their websites is not deemed to be a contribution. Next slide, please. So candidates can accept contributions from the following groups: individuals who are normally resident in Ontario, and the candidate and their spouse. Now, when we speak about third-party advertisers, we note that they may accept contributions from individuals normally resident in Ontario, trade unions that hold bargaining rights for employees in Ontario, and corporations that carry on business in Ontario. The slide also clarifies a few key points as they relate to determining whether corporations are considered to be one contributor or not. So firstly, if one corporation controls the others directly or indirectly, then they are considered to be the same contributor. If the corporations are owned or controlled by the same person or groups of persons, either directly or indirectly, they are considered to be the same contributor. Next slide, please. Candidates and third-party advertisers cannot accept contributions from the following groups. And as you can see in the slide, there is a fairly long list, but I will be brief. So for instance, we're dealing with political parties at the federal or provincial levels. We're also looking at governments, either be they federal, provincial, or municipal, a school board, and of course, a business or group that is not a corporation. Now, a few words about volunteers. The value of services provided by volunteers is generally not considered to be a contribution. But if a professional, like an accountant or a lawyer, volunteers to provide services for which they would normally be paid, the market value of the service must be recorded as a contribution by the volunteer and as a campaign expense. Next slide, please. Cash contributions may only be accepted up to $25. Contributions more than $25 must be made by check, money order, or by a method that clearly shows where the funds came from. Fundraising functions are events or activities held by or on behalf of a candidate for the primary purpose of raising money for the candidate's campaign. The price of admission to a fundraising function is a campaign contribution, and a receipt must be issued for the full amount. Receipts must be issued for every contribution and should contain the name and address of the contributor and the amount and date. Next slide, please. Now, a few words about contribution limits. The limit on contributions to any one candidate or registered third-party advertiser is $1,200. The individual contribution amount has increased from $750 to $1,200, but the aggregate amount of $5,000 remains the same. Since candidates and third-party advertisers are required to inform contributors of contribution limits, you may want to include the limits on the receipts provided to the contributors. Next slide, please. Self-funding limits. There is a limit on the amount that a candidate for a municipal office can make to their own campaign. This limit also applies to contributions made by the candidate's spouse. The self-funding limit for municipal council candidates based on the number of electors voting for the office to a maximum of $25,000 per candidate are the specific numbers that I wanted to allude to. So the formula for calculating the limit is essentially $7,500 plus 20 cents per elector for head of council, like a mayor, and $5,000 plus 20 cents per elector for other council offices. The highest self-funding limit that anyone can possibly have is, again, $25,000. For more information about this topic and this formula, you may want to refer to page 19 of the 2022 Candidates Guide, which is available online for downloading and viewing on the ministry's website. Next slide, please. Now we move on to the next topic, which is borrowing. Please note that loans can only be borrowed from a bank or other recognized lending institution in Ontario and must be directed into the campaign account. The loan isn't considered to be campaign income, and paying it back is not a campaign expense. But if you or your spouse guarantee the loan and the campaign does not repay all of it, the remaining balance is considered to be a contribution. Keep in mind the contribution limit for the candidate and spouse if borrowing. Any interest that the campaign pays on the loan is a campaign expense. Next slide, please. And this brings us to campaign expenses. For the purposes of the Municipal Elections Act, the following are considered campaign expenses, and those can be grouped according to candidates and third-party advertisers. So for candidates, it's costs incurred for goods or services by or under the direction of the candidate, wholly or partly for use in their election campaign. And you also see that for third-party advertisers, the rules are relatively similar, so I won't repeat some of those considerations. So for more information about specific examples of campaign expenses, you can turn to page 21 of the candidate's guide if you're a candidate. But essentially, we're looking at things like the value of contributions of goods and services. We talked about interest on loans. We also spoke briefly about some other similar things like fees. But you'll also note other examples like the cost of holding parties and making other expressions of appreciation at the close of voting. And you'll hear more about that further in this presentation when we discuss the formulas. Next slide, please. Candidates and third-party advertisers should become familiar with campaign expense provisions. The nomination filing fee is no longer an expense and is not included on the financial disclosure form. Goods and services donated to the campaign are also expenses and must be reported. A receipt must be provided for fair market value. Only nominated persons and/or third-party advertisers can incur expenses during their campaign period. All expenses must be reported in the relevant financial disclosure form to be filed with the clerk by the candidate or the third-party advertiser. With respect to campaign inventory, if you ran in the last election and want to use leftover goods such as signs or office supplies, you have to determine what the current market value for those goods is and what it would cost if you were to purchase them today. These amounts are recorded as an expense. If you end up with leftover inventory at the end of this campaign and it becomes your personal property, but if you want to store them to use in another election, any costs for storage are not considered campaign expenses. Next slide. The spending limit formula for candidates and the maximum amount for parties after voting day are set out in Ontario Regulation 101/97. To access this regulation for a closer look, you can use the eLaws website to pull up the Municipal Elections Act. And once you do that, you can access the regulation that I'm referencing right now. And it's important here to underline that the clerk calculates the spending limit twice. So first, upon a candidate filing the nomination form, the clerk shall calculate the spending limit based on the number of electors on the voters list as it existed on September 15th, 2018. And then secondly, the other calculation is based on the number of electors on the voters list as it exists on September 15th, 2022. Please note that this calculation must be provided to candidates on or before September 25th of 2022. Whichever number is higher is the spending limit and the clerk's calculation is final. So again, the clerk is responsible for calculating these figures for candidates and will provide those numbers upon receiving the nomination form from the candidate. Now, the other thing I wanted to clarify here is that the spending limit for expenses related to holding parties and other expressions of appreciation after the close of voting is calculated as 10% of the amount of the candidate's or third-party advertiser's general spending limit and does not count toward the general spending limit. So these two spending limits are separate and they're used for different purposes and for different times and should not be confused with each other. For more information, as a candidate, you may wish to turn to page 22 of the 2022 Candidates Guide. Next slide, please. Candidates will be required to inform their contributors of the contribution limits. That is to say, how much a contributor can contribute to an individual's candidate's campaign and the aggregate limit on the contributions to any one council or local board election. If a third-party advertiser has registered in more than one municipality, each registration is a separate campaign with its own spending limits. Third-party advertisers are also required to ensure contributions and expenses are tracked and accounted for. Proper record retention, proper direction is provided to those incurring expenses or accepting contributions on their behalf, and that spending limits are adhered to. Next slide, please. Most expenses are subject to the spending limit, but those listed on this slide are not. So I'll read a few examples from the slide, but once this presentation becomes available, we encourage you to go through it, to leaf through some of these slides and to have a closer look at the examples. So for instance, these expenses include holding a fundraising event or activity, expenses related to a recount. Another example is audit and accounting fees, expenses related to a court action for a controverted election, and expenses incurred after voting day, just to provide a few examples from the slide. So expenses related to fundraising functions are exempt from the campaign spending limit, but in order to qualify as a fundraising function, an event must have the raising of money as its primary purpose. Similarly, a brochure promoting awareness of a candidate that contains contact information to make campaign contributions doesn't qualify as a fundraising function. Expenses that were subject to the spending limit if incurred before voting day are not subject to the spending limit if incurred after voting day. Next slide, please. Now let's move on to third-party advertisers' spending limits. Third-party advertisers will be subject to two spending limits, very similar to the information I provided regarding candidates. There's a general spending limit and a separate limit for expenses related to parties and expressions of appreciation after the close of voting day. And the formula, again, can be found under Ontario Regulation 101/97. And as you can see on the slide, the formula for calculating third-party advertising spending limits is $5,000 plus 5 cents per elector to a maximum of $25,000. The formula used is based on the number of electors entitled to vote in an election in the municipality. The Municipal Elections Act also provides that the spending limit for parties and expressions of appreciation after voting day be set at 10% of the general spending limit. So again, this would be consistent with the spending limit for council candidates. Next slide, please. So let's explore some more information regarding the campaign finance rules. As a candidate or third-party advertiser, it is important that you be fully aware of the responsibilities regarding election spending and accepting campaign contributions. A question we are asked from time to time is whether there is a requirement for every candidate to have a chief financial officer. And in case you were wondering, the answer to that question is no. We suggest that you familiarize yourselves with sections 88.8 to section 88.21 of the Municipal Elections Act, and also the financial statements that you will be required to file. This will help guide you in organizing your records and how they have to be reported. You're required under the Municipal Elections Act to keep accurate records and open a campaign bank account if you are spending any money or accepting any contributions. So that theme was already mentioned in the presentation, but we do want to emphasize its importance. And in case you are wondering, page 24 of the Candidate's Guide provides more information about some of the topics I just listed on the slide. Next slide, please. Candidates and third-party advertisers are required to keep complete and accurate financial statements during the course of their campaigns. All contributions and expenses are to be accounted for and disclosed by the candidate on the relevant prescribed form. The prescribed forms are available online for downloading and viewing. If I remember correctly, there are 9 prescribed forms, including the financial statements for candidates and third-party advertisers. And again, all candidates and third-party advertisers are required to keep all campaign financial records until after November 15th, 2026, when a new council takes office. These rules apply whether you're elected or not. Next slide, please. As part of our role, we like to share best practices with municipalities and other stakeholders. And this slide provides a few ideas with regards to campaign finance records and reporting. As a best practice, candidates and third-party advertisers should do the following things. So store receipts in a secure place, as they are valuable documents. Receipts must be signed by the candidate or his or her designate. It is good practice to have a receipt that is a multi-part form, one for the contributor and one or more for the candidate's records. Receipts should be sequentially numbered. And again, open a bank account which provides monthly statements and canceled checks. You may wish to also produce duplicate deposit slips for every deposit, listing the names of the contributors and the amounts received from each. It's also a best practice to maintain a petty cash fund to handle minor expenses and obtain invoices to support all payments from the fund. And as I mentioned earlier, candidates and third-party advertisers may find it useful to look at Form 4 if they're candidates and Form 8 if they're third-party advertisers, respectively, at the beginning of their campaign. So here I'm alluding to the prescribed forms that you can download online. Next slide. Campaign advertisements. The period for third-party advertisements, as shown on the slide, is the period when the rules for third-party advertisers apply. In 2022, that is from May 1st, 2022 until the close of voting at 8 p.m. on October 24th, 2022. So please note, third-party advertisers and candidates are required to identify themselves on signs and advertisements. And on the slide, you can see examples of some of the information that you'll want to be aware of in these instances, such as the name of the candidate or third-party advertiser, the name, business address, and telephone number of the individual who deals with the broadcaster or publisher under the direction of the candidate or third-party advertiser. And the third-party advertiser must also include the name of the municipality where the third-party advertiser is registered. Next slide. The broadcaster or publisher of a third party or candidate advertisement shall maintain records containing the following information for a period of 4 years after the date the advertisement appears, and shall permit the public to inspect the records during normal business hours. And here again, you can see some of the crucial information to keep in mind. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, this slide deck will become available to participants of the session, so you can return to review the specific examples at your leisure in the future. Next slide, please. Now let's discuss financial statements. Candidates and third-party advertisers must file their financial statement on or before 2 p.m. Friday, March 31st of 2023. If a candidate or third-party advertiser feels that they will not meet the deadline, they may apply to the courts for an extension prior to the March 31st, 2023 deadline. According to the Municipal Elections Act, all candidates are required to file Form 4 with the clerk, regardless of how much or how little they spent or fundraised. If you filed a nomination form, you must file a Form 4. This form is required even if you withdraw your nomination or were acclaimed. If you registered as a third-party advertiser, you must complete a Form 8. A candidate may resubmit a financial statement to correct an error up until the filing deadline, which again is March 31st, 2023. The clerk is required to make public a report which candidates filed financial statements and which did not. So bear that in mind too. Next slide. All contributions must be reported. And the clerk is required to make financial statements available to the public in an electronic format free of charge. The appointment of an auditor by the candidate is mandatory if expenses or contributions exceeded $10,000. Now, if you find yourself in that situation, an important fact to remember here is that the auditor must be licensed under the Public Accounting Act, 2004. Next slide. Candidates can file their financial documents at any time after voting day to January 3rd of 2023. So this is adjusted from December 31st as it falls on a Saturday. So we're keeping the weekend in mind here. Filing the financial statement ends the campaign period. This will make it easier for acclamations and campaigns where little or no expense is incurred. Clerks will be required to report whether candidates have met their financial filing obligation and publish that report on the municipal website or in another electronic form. Clerks can determine the conditions for the electronic filing of financial statements. Next slide. The nomination fee is only refundable if the financial statement is filed on time. A candidate or third-party advertiser who misses the filing deadline may file within the 30-day grace period, provided a $500 late filing fee is paid to the municipality. Please note that a candidate who chooses to file within the 30-day grace period will be subject to both the $500 late filing fee as well as the loss of their nomination refund. A candidate or third-party advertiser may resubmit a financial statement to correct an error up until the filing deadline. Next slide. So now we move on to the topic of campaign surpluses. So when filing the financial statement, a candidate or third-party advertiser with a campaign surplus must pay the entire amount to the clerk. Prior to paying over any surplus funds to the clerk, a candidate or third-party advertiser is entitled to a refund of any contributions they or their spouse, if an individual, made to the campaign, but not anyone else. The clerk is required to place surplus monies in trust for use by the candidate if they need it for a compliance audit. If neither the candidate nor the third-party advertiser requires the funds for these purposes, it becomes the property of the municipality or school board. Next slide. Here it's important to establish that every council and school board must have a compliance audit committee. The members of a compliance audit committee cannot be members of the council or school board, an employee, a candidate in the election, or a registered third-party advertiser. The clerk is to review contributions and to prepare a report for consideration by the Compliance Audit Committee if a contributor appears to have exceeded any contribution limits. If it is apparent to the clerk that a contributor has exceeded one or more of the contribution limits, the clerk would report this to the committee, which would meet to determine whether to proceed with legal action. Electors entitled to vote in an election may apply for a compliance audit even if the candidate has not filed a financial statement. The application must be in writing and set out the elector's reasons that they believe the Municipal Elections Act has been contravened. The application must be submitted to the municipal clerk or the secretary of the school board within 90 days after the filing deadline. The Compliance Audit Committee will consider the application and decide whether to retain an auditor to undertake a compliance audit of the candidate's financial return. Next slide. On the same topic of compliance audits, the Compliance Audit Committee is required to provide brief written reasons for its decision. The Compliance Audit Committee meetings are required to be open to the public, but the committee may deliberate in private. Electors can apply for a compliance audit of a third-party advertiser's campaign finances as well. So, according to the Municipal Elections Act, the written reasons for the committee's decisions shall be given to the candidate, the clerk with whom the candidate filed his or her nomination, the secretary of the local board if applicable, and the applicant. If an audit occurs, the report must be circulated to the same individuals. The committee audit, the audit committee considers the auditor's report. If the compliance audit determines that there has been an apparent contravention of the Municipal Elections Act, the committee will decide whether to proceed with legal action. The decisions of the committee may be appealed to the Superior Court of Justice. But also, it's important to note here that a person who believes that a candidate has contravened the Municipal Elections Act may still proceed with legal action without having first obtained a compliance audit. Next slide. And this brings us to the topic of offenses. So, for instance, it is an offense to directly or indirectly do the following things: offer, give, lend, or promise to give any valuable consideration connected to the exercise or non-exercise of an elector's vote, to offer a person money or other valuables in order to convince them to run for office or refrain from running for office, and to give, procure, or promise to procure an office or employment to induce a voter to vote or not vote, or a candidate to run or not run for office. So one thing that I'll highlight here as well is that potentially on conviction, a candidate may be disqualified from voting at an election until the next regular election has taken place after the election to which the offense relates, in addition to being liable to any other penalty provided for in this act. So, and this of course includes anybody who contravenes the legislation and is convicted of doing so. For more information, we encourage you to refer to page 28 of the Candidates Guide, which provides some supplementary information on the topic of offenses. Next slide. Now, in addition to offenses, we of course have to address the topic of penalties. And in general, the following penalties are available to the courts upon conviction for an offense under the Municipal Elections Act. And I briefly spoke about this before in more general terms, but as you can see here, for individuals, those possible penalties include a maximum fine of $25,000 and up to 6 months of imprisonment. And of course, as I mentioned, ineligibility to run in the next general election, or if convicted of a corrupt practice, to vote in the next general election. And for candidates, the penalties include, for example, penalties for an individual plus, rather, they include the same penalties as for an individual, but also we have to look at things like fines for excess campaign expenses and forfeiture of office if the offense was committed knowingly. You also note here that the maximum fine for trade unions and corporations is much more severe. It's a maximum fine of $50,000. Okay, next slide, please. So moving away from the topic of offenses and penalties, we can now speak about a different issue, which is the voters list. So please note that the preliminary list of electors, as corrected by the clerk, becomes the voters list on September 1st, 2022. The clerk determines who and when individuals can apply to have their name and information corrected or added to or removed from the voters list. The clerk can also remove a name from the list if the clerk becomes aware that the person has died. Next slide. One copy of the voters list can be provided to each municipal candidate or trustee candidate and must be requested from the clerk in writing. Candidates running in a ward are entitled only to that portion of the list that contains the names of the electors entitled to vote for that particular office. And copies of the voters list are not available before September 1st, 2022. The voters list shall not be posted in a public place, and the voters list shall not be made available to the public by posting on an internet website or via any other print or electronic medium of mass communication. Third-party advertisers are not eligible to receive a copy of the voters list. Next slide. Actually, let's go back a slide, sorry. The clerk may require anyone who receives a copy of the list to sign a receipt acknowledging the list is only to be used for election purposes, and any other use would be in violation of the Municipal Elections Act. An elector's name shall appear only once on the list. In a ward system, an elector is entitled to vote only in the ward where he or she resides. Next slide, please. So some of you may be familiar with the concept of voting proxies. A person who is entitled to be an elector in a local municipality may appoint another person who is also entitled to vote as their voting proxy. No proxy appointments can be made until nominations close. A voter must directly appoint another eligible voter by name as their proxy. A person may only act as the voting proxy for one person unless they are acting on behalf of a spouse, sibling, parent, child, grandparent, or grandchild. The prescribed proxy form must be completed by the individual appointing the proxy. And again, as mentioned, those forms are available online. Next slide. Now we move on to the topic of scrutineers. Please note that only a candidate may appoint scrutineers to represent him or her during the voting and the counting of votes, including during a recount, and third-party advertisers cannot appoint scrutineers. In the traditional election where voting takes place at a poll, the designated returning officer is in charge of the activity in the voting place, and the DRO may ask the scrutineer to leave if the scrutineer is not complying with the legislation. And the DRO is Deputy Returning Officer, to be more accurate. So candidates or scrutineers should respect that the DRO must ensure fairness, access, privacy, and security of the vote. So as a useful tip, you may want to check with the clerk to see if a list of the scrutineer's rights is being given to election staff at the poll. If so, use that list or prepare your own and hand that to each of your scrutineers, a list of their rights, which are spelled out under section 47, subsection 5 of the Municipal Elections Act to ensure that those rights are respected. Next slide. Now we move on to the topic of recounts in an election. A recount is automatic if the vote is tied. Councils and school boards have the option of establishing policies prior to the election that also allow for an automatic recount. Council still retains the option to pass a resolution for a recount within 30 days after the clerk has declared the results of the election. An eligible elector can apply to the courts for a recount within 30 days of the clerk's declaration of the results. In all instances, the recount must happen within 15 days of the clerk receiving a court order or council passing a resolution to conduct a recount. The recounts must be held in the same manner as the original count. And at this point, I would like to remind participants in the session that if you at any time have questions about the voting method or procedures in your municipality, please address those questions to your municipal clerk because they'll be able to provide you with the local context. In our presentation today, we're speaking about the broad legislative framework, but you'll notice that municipalities also have a lot of responsibility for tailoring those rules to their local circumstances, including the voting methods they choose and other similar matters. Next slide, please. Now, it's very important to keep the elections-related timelines in mind. Throughout this presentation, you've heard some of the critical timelines, but to help you with planning your campaign, in this slide, we provide a sample of some of the core deadlines to keep in mind. So the May 1st, 2022 timeline has already come and gone. That's when nominations, the nomination period became open. The next timeline that you should keep in mind is August 19th, which is nomination day. So that's the deadline for you to submit your nomination form if you're planning on running for council. October 21st, 2022 is the last day for third-party advertisers to register. October 24th, 2022, of course, is voting day. But next, here comes some other important timelines, which is January 3rd, 2023. This is the timeline for candidates and third-party advertisers to note as the time when their campaign period ends. And lastly, March 31st, 2023 is when campaign financial statements must be filed. Next slide, please. And this brings us to the end of the presentation and to a few helpful resources that you might want to keep in mind as you go on this journey. The first link will take you to the ELAWS website that I mentioned earlier, where all provincial legislation is available online, including the associated regulations. You will want to be familiar with the Municipal Elections Act, the Municipal Act, the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, and if running for school board, the Education Act also becomes a crucial piece of legislation. The second link is to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing's website. From this site, you will be able to access the 2022 Voters Guide, Candidates Guide, and third-party Advertisers Guide. And once you access those resources, you'll find that you can view them either in a browser format, or you can download a PDF copy of each guide, which will allow you to do the Control-F function to search for keywords and to find the topics that are of most interest or use to you. Once on the Municipal World website, if you click on the icon Bookshop, it illustrates a list of books that are related to running for a municipal office. They are available to purchase online if that should interest you. Next slide, please. So this is the end of our presentation. On this slide, you will see the contact information for Lisa Harvey, my colleague who spoke earlier in this presentation. She is the municipal advisor for this area. And if you have any elections questions about the Municipal Elections Act, please direct those questions to Lisa using her email address, or reach out to your clerk if you have more specific questions about the application of the legislation in the City of Cornwall. At this time, I will turn it over to the moderator to take the virtual podium from me and to open for the questions and answers period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa and Peter, for your presentation and outlining a lot of the rules governing the municipal election. At this time, I'm going to stop recording, so all of you may feel comfortable in asking questions without it going to anyone other than our group.